and thank you for having me over for the organization of the event. I'm going to also use this opportunity to congratulate to Donald his birthday, and I'm seeing that he's attending at the moment. Now, without any further ado, let's start with the presentation. We will talk about what happens when machines judge science and why we might want to even consider asking machines about scientific evaluations. And to start on a funny note, this is the most famous Serbian prophet, who is a mockery, of course. He doesn't take himself too seriously, but he also sometimes consults the computer, looks in tarot cards, and is supposed to predict the future. And here, when we are judging science, when we are deciding which research project should be funded, we are looking a little bit, okay, this project is promising, but also at the question, this project will be replicable. And we will come to this replication question several times throughout our discussion, and I hope also during the Q&A. The other reason why it's important to consider machine learning in evaluations of science is because there is, some would say worrisome, some would say expected result that more than half of researchers now use AI for peer review, even against guidance. And this is a recent survey, as you see it, a couple of days ago. This was published in Nature News as a report. And the discussion is how AI is used in peer review in general. And the grant assessment is just one form of the peer review. The emergence of generative AI just puts all this on steroids, so increases the use. And one of the discussions that we had, also that I had with the reviewers of my papers, was like, why do we care when this is not maybe applied from the perspective of the grant office? Well, because the researchers will consult AI even if they are not instructed to do it. And then it's not that we can just say, this shouldn't be the case, so we will not discuss it. We could do something better and think, okay, maybe we can indeed simplify the process and use it, but how to do it responsibly. So that's the angle from which we're gonna observe the discussion. And the new paper that was talking about it has been recently published in Synthese. It's now focused specifically on the use of generative AI. And the motivation for this was that the Dutch Research Council invited me to discuss with them specifically this topic and gave me some questions about it, and to which I tried to answer, and then I extended it to a further research. And it's all building up on some prior work that I did on the use of different AI technologies in predicting scientific success and the scientific project success, so some type of machine evaluations of projects and potential advice of funding decisions. There is another important value aspect if we are considering the use of machines to decide who gets funds. Then we have the problem potentially with whether these decisions are democratic or not. The values don't emerge from data. I mean, they shouldn't emerge from data. We can build, of course, we can also ask ChatGPT to prescribe something, but that is not something which we should do. So imagine a scenario in which a scientific research in psychology is fully automated. The question is asked by ChatGPT, then through different softwares, it is calculated what should be the sample size, how it should how data should be collected, so what should be the methodology. And then, for instance, we are measuring intellectual virtues, we are measuring intellectual justice of people. And then this is posted as an online survey process. Participants are filling the survey. And then the AI analyzes the results, writes the paper, publishes it. So it can be almost fully automated. And then what are we losing? We are losing certain values there. For instance, we are losing diversity. And on top of that, we can have this on the meta level. So who is evaluating this research? Well, another AI system is evaluating this research. And who is deciding whether the research should be conducted or not? Well, also the AI system. And that question is not now anymore a question of whether scientists will become redundant, whether they will have jobs. No, the focus is actually on whether they will have intellectual autonomy and how to strengthen our intellectual autonomy in the age of AI. But I think it's a very useful tool. And as you notice, I also use it sometimes to generate illustrations. I also show this to my students to discuss whether these illustrations are good ones or bad ones. And maybe if you ever use this, you can see that there are a lot of systems which also flag generated illustrations, but that is possible to, of course, go around, right? One can take a screenshot, then it wouldn't be, metadata will be deleted, it wouldn't be checked and so on, but it's not about cheating, in my opinion. In my opinion, it's about accurately representing what was happening. But then we come to this gray area. If someone was really prompting it and really thinking critically about it, how much reporting is actually needed. And that's something which is a question of a large debate currently done in science policy. And this is whether AI should be considered an author or not, or whether we have to credit everything that AI did or not, and in which way, because generative AI, as we also see from different surveys, is extensively being used in science. To go back to the question of grant review, why do we want automated grant review? Well, because there are a lot of critiques of the current peer review system. And I would be very curious in the Q&A to hear your opinions, whether you like the current system, whether you think it's good enough or better than something else, and so forth. Of course, I think everybody would agree that it's very time-consuming and costly. So people don't enjoy to do it. That's why they reach out to some tool which will speed up the process. But it's also criticized as unreliable. And there are studies which point that there is a poor inner rater consistency among, so this means that kind of when we have a reviewer 1 and reviewer 2, they often don't agree. So all these memes about reviewer 2, there is statistics supporting it, that how much reviewers agree is actually not very very strong. Then in the case of the grant assessments, the correlation between the results and so how fruitful some project was in the end once it was finished, and how it was assessed in the beginning by the reviewers is actually weak. And that makes sense, because then peer review is done on a paper which is already on a study which has already been done. So on a paper which has also scientific results in a discussion and so on, we can really evaluate whether this was correct. But if we are in this second stage, that we are supposed to predict whether some research will be fruitful, then we go again to the Serbian prophet, looking at cards, trying to decide, okay, this will be successful. So it's a much harder epistemic task to do it. And because this system is so time consuming, both from the perspective of reviewers, but also from the perspective of applicants, there is a push for a lottery approach, because it could reduce the biases of individual reviewers and also the workload of the reviewers, and more importantly, also potentially the workload of the applicants. But it does introduce some type of randomness in the decision-making about science. And there are different versions of when this lottery approach can be used. So it could be used immediately it could be only used once initial evaluation rounds passed. So then they are like 10 top projects, and then to decide which 3 out of these top 10 will be awarded. And I can and that's something that funding agencies are experimenting with, but I can also bring my concerns about this approach is that if it's something highly competitive and then we are letting a machine decide in the end, especially for these important individual grants, which currently in our European science system are bringing huge career advantage, then people can feel that this is really unjust. And also the staple of approval for that scientist decreases. So the question of the motivation and the question of the perceived justice and fairness are there something to be examined. But if we are changing the whole structure and thinking of what should be funded from different perspectives, of course, from the perspective of social epistemology, maybe that will increase diversity of funding, because that we might want from the group perspective that as many as possible diverse projects are funded, and that will increase the chances that we reach some knowledge. So it's open for the debate, but then the whole recognition system would have to shift significantly before experimenting with it. Again, I'm curious to hear the reactions on this topic. So why some of the reasons why the peer reviewers are considered to be biased and unreliable, well, they could do gatekeeping, so specifically not willing to grant some person funding, because often these grants are not anonymous. Sometimes they are. Then they can be biased by factors like institutional prestige, just by certain affiliation. Someone can get more points in the eyes of the reviewer, but also the gender can influence it, the race, I don't know. So the Dutch funding agency now doesn't want us to write our first name so that the gender cannot be figured out. But I mean, if I have my Sikimić, especially with my ch, which now I'm not having on Zoom, but that clearly indicates that I come from East Europe, and that will potentially could be some demarcation for discrimination. We don't know whether it is, but it's not easy to erase all these identifiers. Plus, of course, if you're writing about your biography, even though reviewers are instructed not to Google you, what is the chance that humans will really not do it? I think it's very hard not to do it, but maybe. Maybe this really happens. And also in the smaller fields, people actually know each other. So we go again. So there can be both positive and negative bias about people. And then there is also the cognitive and statistical bias. And it can be just if someone is researching in the same area as us, and we believe this is a very promising research line, and we just honestly think this is a great project and this is so promising, but it still might be biased. And not epistemically best. The additional problem is the incentive structure, and that's the lack of accountability and the minimal positive incentives for reviewers to contribute to the system's flaws, because reviewers for the grant system, they are getting paid, but for the peer review in journals, they're in most cases not being paid. And this is just some extra labor that we are taking. And it's also like, what is the accountability of a reviewer if they make a mistake? And that's this funny illustration that I tried to make. So this is like epistemic crime without the punishment. But that can be extended to the further topic of replication, how actually studies which are not replicable, are they really, like, is this punishment really strong that researchers will get? Especially, so of course, if someone is conducting academic fraud deliberately, that is And if that's caught, that can be a big deal. But if someone is just over-interpreting the results, not conducting a very systematic study, but fragmented smaller ones and so forth, just to have more publications, that is most likely, and I guess most people would agree, right, that shouldn't be get any harsh punishment from the scientific community. But then the question comes again, whether we can externally, from the perspective of science funding, change something. And that's why this grant review process is so important. And that's why I worked on it for, now several years, actually. And because it can really direct science in certain ways. And if we, and there is one, like a very fringe idea that we could now maybe change the way of funding so much with external grants, or at least giving recognition to external grants, and instead have the first stream funding, so the funding that comes from the university itself for researchers there, and that potentially could increase the reliability. But it's all to be discussed and checked, and has to be done reliably. In any case, the idea is that machines at least won't be doing this gatekeeping, because the machines are not at least individually biased, especially if they're trained on the large data sets, and that we could also maybe protect it slightly from certain cognitive biases, even though that's also not a super trivial task. We also know that machines have already been used for pre-screening of job applications in industry, for finding reviewers. We know this is cheap and fast. We know that it can be based on certain merits of the application, so it's not completely random like lottery. What we also know is that some funding agencies, well, at least I know of one in Spain, which is now using AI as some part of the review process. So that's happening. And experimenting with it as one of the potential ways of allocating science funds would be justified. And that's what we're going to discuss. So the key questions: can we reliably use AI in grant review? Should we do it? And to which degree? That's a bigger overarching question. To which degree should science be automated? The generative AI in grant review can give the qualitative assessment of the text, which is different from the standard methods, which I used before, that are giving just the qualitative assessment of input and output project parameters. And it requires adequate prompting. Now this prompting is becoming a whole science, well, not a science, but a whole skill in its own, how to do it, and like whether to use the capital letters and words such must, and a directive language, how to communicate with ChatGPT. On the other hand, it is also getting more and more personalized. So I can now train AI on my own work, to write in my own writing style. And there is a huge push that it gets integrated in all of our personal computers, and to give already some type of automated responses. So that's something interesting, and we will see in whether this, at the moment, this prompting really matters, but we will see what the future brings. Of course, what we are now aware is that these tools are owned by private companies. And we have the question of the privacy of all the uploaded sensitive data, because someone's grant application is a sensitive data, and are sensitive data. If funding agencies want to experiment with this, I would strongly recommend that they develop their own systems, or at least that everything is stored locally if they are using some other system, but everything is stored locally, and to be very careful with prompting and with instructions and with what's happening inside. So the risks and the mitigation strategies of these risks, one is the privacy that we just mentioned, and that's only to use local servers or protected services. Then profiling, which would mean which also humans do, making decisions based on someone's past success about their future, but with machines that can become very dangerous. And for mitigating this risk, we need to diversify the methods of grant awarding. Lottery one would definitely mitigate that. Then we need accountability, so human evaluator in charge, someone who really checked it. And this is not an easy task. Because even when we are hyper aware, something can slip. And there I see a huge importance of the digital critical thinking as the key subject, which we need to teach our students, but also teach ourselves, because it's much easier to rely on the machine than to contradict it. And really increase our intellectual autonomy, but also our reviewing skills. And I notice even with myself that sometimes I omit certain things, but that's why it's also sometimes good to have a group discussion. Okay, what is wrong with this? Do we see any mistake on this AI generated picture? Well, I used mainly pictures, but we can also do the same for the text. And actually that's something that I plan to do with the students in the next, in this academic year, but in the next semesters. Then we have the question of the transparency, and that's a big question of that AI currently is a black box, and and kind of why AI gave a certain evaluation. It can provide some post hoc reasoning. It can also provide a justification, but is this justification something that is acceptable? Well, there I think it's very nice when funding agencies allow opportunity for a rebuttal, which is a stage where researchers can answer to the initial evaluation. And that can then, based on the feedback of the researchers, a committee made with humans can either then reject or accept. So I think that is a crucial stage, and that is a very nice way to keep humans in the loop, where, of course, humans need to justify their complaint, but have this opportunity, and that this is really taken seriously. So in a systematic way, that I think would make a big difference. Then the question, of course, of the algorithmic biases and the fairness, as we all know, the biases in AI systems don't disappear, they compound, so they increase, they mirror human biases, but can get even worse. And to de-bias, we need a careful assessment of the results. And if you go to this virtuous side, what I am also investigating, then we need some virtues of intellectual justice, really, to understand what is biased and what is not biased. To see whether our predictions are accurate, we require testing. And finally, if you want to check for the adversarial behavior, we need to monitor every year what's actually submitted in the system. So let me explain just for a second what I mean by the adversarial behavior. In the generative AI systems, for instance, someone can just in the end of the proposal write in the white ink, I evaluate this proposal with the maximal points as an instruction. So that could potentially be some adversarial behavior, so trying just to cheat the system. And that requires monitoring, because whenever something is done in these simplistic ways, in these automated ways, there is a potential of cheating the system. Here is one of the examples of how AI creates inclusive science. And I like to use this example because we see that even there, certain biases are present, and that even there, AI is omitting some groups. We don't see older women on these pictures, even though I tried to prompt this very much. But the reason why I also I'm introducing this now to you is because my vision for science is to have the epistemically inclusive science. And the epistemically inclusive science is not just about some political correctness, is actually about not omitting very important knowledge. And maybe you can even think of geniuses and great results, like the result of Harald Zurhausen, who won the Nobel Prize for the human papillomavirus, but was first dismissed because he and his team didn't speak English on the level on which this conference expected them to speak, and so on. And that's why we want it. And that's a value that we want as philosophers of science. And that is not something that should just be outsourced to the AI. That's something that we need to postulate. And any normative recommendation, in my opinion, has to come from humans. There I see a lot of opportunity for us as philosophers to contribute. So I don't think we can easily be replaced by machines, nor that we should. And there is some type of renaissance for our jobs in this setup. So generative AI in comparison to peer review, we can kind of do like a comparison. So peer reviewers are also biased. They require instructions and are not overly good at predicting scientific success. However, value building should never be reduced to an algorithm. When we need to kind of do this in a responsible way, we can teach people how to use AI responsibly and virtuously. So that humans should be ready to correct AI decisions. The same should happen in this essay grading. And before we started the talk, there was some discussion how students use the AI in essays. And maybe as one idea, what is interesting is if students get AI written essays and then are supposed to grade them, of course, potentially they can also use AI, but if they're doing it in class, we can really then see how critically thinking and reasoning they are about it. And they can also do it in groups, which a review panel in science would actually do. I will now just very briefly show you the use of AI in another study in a specific case, but this use was not done with generative AI. And it was done on the data from Fermilab, which is one of the biggest and the most successful laboratory in physics that had very carefully curated data. That's why it was possible to use it. But this data had very clear input and output parameters, so we couldn't really assess qualitatively. It is a very quantitative measure of the success. Surprisingly, we didn't actually expect that we will get the moderately high accuracy, which we did, but we analyzed 67 experiments from there and used different predictive algorithms. Well, first we measured efficiencies, and then on another data set, we did the predictive analysis, and then we got the match of showing moderately high accuracy of predictions, which is great and surprising. And one of the explanations, so we got the list of efficient experiments, and we also got how to improve, suggestions how to improve each inefficient project in order to become efficient. That leaves, of course, some space for further adversarial behavior, because one could attune the project to the needs. But what is important and what is interesting there is that an important insight is that this is really field specific. And even within the field of high energy physics, in which these projects were coming from, even there we had to go qualitatively over and all the experiments that were analyzed, because precision measurements have behave differently. Their citation metrics behave very differently than the real experiments and so on, and the calibrations of instruments. So they have different patterns, citation patterns, different behaviors, and so on. So the idea, and that's a danger which I see, is that someone says, okay, now we will use the same mechanism to evaluate different sciences. And we see from this example that even within the same subfield of science, not all experiments can be compared. So even there, we need to be more fine-grained and really have a qualitative analysis on what is comparable in order to give it a meaningful interpretation. So in addition to the incomparable parameters, the problem are, of course, the outliers. And we do have some projects which are just outliers and also much bigger and behave in different ways, but they indeed get different type of funding in any case. And we have the issue of the unobservable variables, such as motivation of researchers or team cohesion, which is something that should be assessed on an interview, in my opinion. And again, this interview, in my opinion, should still be with humans, even though, of course, in this dystopic scenario, also the machines can record us and see how, measure how often we blink, how we smile, and how focused we are in the interaction with each other, and then judge and make some predictions of our team cohesion and motivation. But that I find very dystopic and very dangerous also regarding the privacy, but also regarding the accuracy. There is this potential that someone just says, okay, if I have 5 team members, then I will score better than if I have 3 team members. I'm simplifying, but just that you understand. And then just try to win against the system. And there, again, we need to increase the data each year and monitor for those issues. The way how AI could be integrated in grant review, it could be used as a pre-screening method of applications, but it could also be used as a corrective measure in the post-screening process. So the benefit of the pre-screening would be to decrease the number of applications that humans need to review. And the benefit of the post-screening would be to reduce the biases in potential gatekeeping of human reviewers. Peer reviewers can take into account the results of algorithmic assessment, but they could potentially also have the autonomy to dismiss it. They could use the AI to help them to speed up the process, but that is actually a more dangerous use and requires trainings and requires, again, so special licenses and instructions from the funding agencies on how to do it. And we can also do something else. So the AI can actually take into account, the AI that I presented to you now, that is just using input and output parameters, could use some input or output parameter from what humans are saying. And it could use the motivation of the group and just kind of what we as a review panel decide could be just, we can say the motivation, we are scoring it on the scale from 1 to 10. And that's what we're going to put then in the machine later. That is possible. Not that I would recommend it. Since I'm not a machine, I have to drink water from time to time. The increased use of generative AI in science leads to the already cluttering of the whole system. And when we think from the perspective of social epistemology, that's not beneficial because we have to process many more publications and submissions of manuscripts, but also the grant applications, and because it assists in writing. And again, it could be good if these results are really high quality, but if they are of the dubious quality, the system really gets overwhelmed. And then the reviewers get overwhelmed. And of course, then the reviewers might also start evaluating with AI. And there is this risk of a vicious loop of science written with AI, generated with AI, assessed with AI, grants awarded with AI, and that we are losing the human in the loop. We don't want that because we do know that the way how we are building our theory or our normative decisions is not only based on the data, but it's also based on the public opinions, but it's and by the theory itself, or actually by philosophical views. And my favorite example why this is dangerous is the moral machine experiment, where people are asked, so we can go online and fill this survey about our moral intuitions, how the automated vehicle should behave, whether the automated vehicle should, in this first picture, sacrifice the passengers, and in the second picture, sacrifice the pedestrians crossing the zebra. And I heard all sorts of weird intuitions. Some people saying the humans in the car must be sacrificed because the pedestrians are not using any technology, and already your decision to use a car, you're more powerful and whatever, you should bear responsibility. To me, that sounded strange. But then also more strange and more counterintuitive results of this were that when these it was about the groups of people in the experiment. So if someone is a doctor, then people don't want to sacrifice them. They're more ready to sacrifice older people, so some type of ageism. And that we know all these discussions from the ethical perspective are questionable, and we want a really well-grounded ethics and not just the public opinion, which is pulled out of the large amount of data. In the case of generative AI, it's even pulled from the data which is online, when we don't know how representative certain data sets are. We do have an idea of on which countries they train it and so on. So we know that, for instance, there is a lot of data from India also coming. So it's not only the global north. However, it is still not a representative set at all. I mean, that's only for the open AI, but there are also other systems and on what they're trained and how representative that is. Due to the size and how large it is, I could believe that there is something as machine wisdom. So the new term referring to the wisdom of crowds that AI might have. However, normative decisions are not just the same as some epistemic stances. So the normative is about what should be the case and not what is the case. And there, of course, humans need to decide. And we also know that we are also updating what should be the case over time. So we have both the progress when it comes to our epistemic values and when it comes to our moral values. And that's not something that would happen if we outsource all this to the machines. And when we think about science funding, we are funding science based on the need, based on what the public is perceiving as a need, but also based on what experts perceive as deep research, because not every research will be applied or is applied or might one day be applied. But we are funding research because we find it promising, even though the hypothesis might fail. So it's not only about whether the hypothesis will necessarily succeed. So there are different layers of this consideration. And the normative aspects related to automated grant review are the limitations in data, are the fairness and the epistemic inclusion, and the diversity of this data, and the alignment with human values. These values, in my opinion, should be the equity and inclusion, and there to prompt generative AI to be inclusive. Yes, it is possible, as you saw in this illustration, but it is not easy. And it's also to say, okay, think of one really has to prompt it actively to search for diversity. And that's something that I am interested in exploring further, whether that would indeed be the real epistemic diversity, because there is this argument that the use of AI is just leading to monocultures. And just to the way how we are already thinking. The way to mitigate this from the external perspective is to have separate funding schemes where grants are awarded in different ways. Great, we are doing good with time. We now come to a more fundamental question of what do we want from science funding? And I here have the illustration of Scylla and Charybdis, and you can think of one as this hyper-productive capitalist view of what is the role of science and how science should be very productive and how we should reward productivity and the way how prolific a scientist is. And then we have also the Charybdis, and that comes from the way from my background from Serbia, how science was funded and still partially is funded, with the idea that this is a socialist view, with the idea that science is just funded without really measuring its impact, and that is very demotivating. So to explain, to just give some examples. So the idea there was that people get permanent positions very early, which is great, right? It gives the job stability. But there is not much of this project funding. So there was not. Now it's introduced. And there is not much competitiveness. People are just doing their own thing. They have the first stream funding, so funding that comes from the government. And the way how they're evaluated is very minimal, especially in some disciplines. So they decide among each other what should be the great goal and the great success of science. And they say, okay, we just publish 4 papers in a local journal, you can become assistant professor. Publish 8, you can become associate professor. And I mean, it's not very far from the truth what I'm saying. So it's not a big exaggeration. And because so they require some presentations and some citations, but very, very limited. And then the question there is that this system becomes very demotivating. So scientists, they would like to do more, but first of all, they think, okay, already to achieve this, it's so much, it's the top. and they're even surprised, okay, but we could actually achieve much more. But it's also demotivating in a sense, no one else, if other people around are not trying much, and if I don't have the need, the external push to try much, I might not do it. And that's really depending on a person. Some people might still be very ambitious and do amazing work, which we did see, of course, but others really might not. And then the idea is how to find the golden middle between really avoiding effort and giving this external funding for very promising projects for people who have a very high ambition and a promising team and are ready to invest a lot of time into their research and need, because think of a large project in biology, it requires funding, and this other this other idea that they're like all of a sudden wasting so much time. We are all, in order to get promoted, we need to acquire specific amounts. We are spending so much time on writing proposals instead of actually doing the research. And then in this ultimate stance, actually making the contributing to the replication crisis, because people just publish as much as possible and are not really checking what exactly is happening there. So how to fund science is a value-loaded decision by itself. And some purposes of grant funding are to motivate scientists, also to open doors to new ideas and people. And the grants indeed can open door to people who come from different environments, underprivileged groups, and so on. They can help this peer review system. That's one of the reasons why it's there, is actually to help us to promote people that come from different backgrounds. So not to just have the citations based on the intellectual prestige, but based on the real merit and on what's written in a proposal. We want to promote diversity because we know that increases the knowledge. We potentially want to increase the productivity, but there is associated risk of overproduction and of non-replicable results. So we need to find the path between Scylla and Charybdis and pass through it. There was last year a very popular and viewed YouTube talk of Sabine Hosenfelder, who was talking about sharing. So she is a physicist in Munich, and she now claims that she stopped doing science and just does these popular YouTube videos about science. But this one was particularly popular because she was talking about kind of why she stopped doing science and how frustrated she was with the funding system of academia, which required from her to constantly apply for grants and not even actually having the right research, and only making incremental steps to get more funding and so forth. And there, really, we see that if we would increase the first stream of funding, so the funding that comes fixed from the universities, that would increase job satisfaction and would remove some pressure and would potentially mitigate this issue of overproduction and increase the reflection that scientists can spend on the research, and also then the quality of the research. The second, the second aspect of the course of action that we should try, in my opinion, try to increase the diversity. So the diversity of topics and projects, and also diversity of methods of assessment. That would definitely help. And of course, we need to be very careful when checking for biases of the AI given suggestions. Another lesson that needs to be kept in mind is the tailored approach. So we don't need something that's too tight or too loose. We need something that fits well with the research discipline that we are addressing, and even with the research question that we are addressing. So during the COVID pandemic, we had a real need to accelerate science, to be fast. And that was possible to be done because there was like a very specific, there was a specific set of questions, some coming from humanities about trust in science, but others coming from life sciences to really address the pandemic. And these very targeted research questions, it was possible to accelerate science by funding and putting a lot of funding in it. And that was a very rational decision. But I think there the need for it was recognized both by researchers, but by funding bodies and also by the general public. However, we also need to fund in times of non-crisis, the exploratory research, and exploratory research can have negative results. And that's something that we need to be open for. And then whether humans or whether even AI can really well predict good exploratory research with negative results, it's a question. And for that, we might have to really think about how to differently prompt and which different parameter choice we need to use if we are using AI in these cases, or maybe just not use it in these cases. The virtues that humans need to develop in order to use AI better, and we are all trying to develop them ourselves. Some of them, so these are the basic ones. I try to track them based on each aspect of the use of AI in science, but the basic ones are coming from the 4 principles of responsible AI, so fairness, transparency, accountability, and privacy. And Thilo Hagendorf, who was also in Tübingen, I think he's now in Stuttgart, he introduced this framework of the ethical virtues, and I now introduce the intellectual virtues that correspond to it. When we talk about algorithmic fairness, we need to increase our sense of justice. But when we are thinking in the scientific term, where what is at stake is the quality of knowledge, then we need intellectual justice or epistemic justice. I use these 2 terms synonymously. When we talk about the transparency of AI, we need honesty, and in the context of science, intellectual honesty. So honestly reporting our findings, but also the that we don't know something, or how we are inferring from something that AI is giving. But also when creating, and both creating the data and creating the software solutions, we need intellectual honesty. Then there is the accountability, which comes, according to Thiele, with responsibility, while in science we talk about intellectual responsibility and even group intellectual responsibility. So intellectual responsibility plays a big role in the context of grant review. And if we are talking about a committee awarding a grant, then we have the group epistemic responsibility. Privacy is an interesting one. And in ethics, it comes with a virtue of care. But in epistemology, I would say that it comes with a moderate curiosity, because, of course, we can collect a lot of data. If we are interested in some psychological research, we could use the example I said before, really monitor all of us, how our eyes move, how we smile, measure all that, collect all the data about us. But that is not a moderate curiosity. That's a very extreme level of curiosity that might not be justified. And it can also be epistemically not justified, in a sense, is this really going to bring some benefit? And when we are often, if you're seeing these ethical reviews of studies, they're not only checking whether something is ethically grounded, they also check slightly, at least, whether something is epistemically grounded, whether this question justifies the measures that are being done, whether the curiosity is not too strong, but really directed in the right way. A necessary requirement for funding, which is leading science in a certain direction, is to keep experts in the loop and not allowing AI to dictate our funding goals. Different fields require different approaches, and proper training regarding the risks associated with the use of AI is needed by the evaluators in case we want to use AI. And for the future of research, of my research, but I think also of this topic of the automation of science, we should strengthen intellectual autonomy, intellectual justice, and scientific integrity of researchers when using AI. And why do I find this so important is because, as mentioned, so the question is not about whether our jobs will become redundant, but whether we will really lose our intellectual autonomy, and how, in which jeopardy our scientific integrity will be with this AI shift in science. And not to finish on this gloomy note, but on a more positive one, I do think that the technology can be a good servant, but a bad master. So let's try to learn how to be good masters of it.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think we can start with the discussion, and Donald has the first hand raised.
Super. Thank you so much, Vlasta. This is a really interesting work, and congrats on the grant. Yeah, so I think I really like that you are going well beyond the sort of like, pointing all the ways in which, maybe involving AI in different ways and peer review and grant review is a bad idea. Also, sort of the adjacencies about sort of like predicting, research impact and quality down the line. There's lots of emerging work on this already, and I think these points are well received. But I think it's a really great idea. It's like the community is ready to go those extra steps and say like, okay, let's get into the weeds of like proposing concrete models and sort of the sort of guardrails, like the virtues that should guide our efforts in finding out what are good ways of involving AI. So I guess I have a question about that, sort of adjacent to that, sort of just like how good could it ever be, right? Sort of just like thinking through the sort of ultimate potentials of this. And so there I have this worry that when we have these sort of like very like this very difficult task of predicting something like the intrinsic sort of quality of research or its intrinsic sort of like epistemic potentials. That is just a super hard thing to do, right? And very often we have to work with really poor proxies, right? So we look at things like citations and citation networks, or sort of the funding attracted by particular scientists or their groups or institutions and so on. And we use them sort of as proxies to predict sort of what we're ultimately after, which is not those things necessarily, but sort of, whatever it is that drives things, or at least in an ideal world. And so, like, one of my worries is that, it seems like in our very sort of imperfect, messy world, we're not ever going to be able like to actually train good AI systems to make this predictive task. And why is that? Well, it's because everything is sort of like endogenous, right? There's like, massive kinds of like selection bias and sort of other kinds of sort of funding bias across the landscape. So we're never really going to get our hands on sort of the relevant counterfactuals, right? Like, what would happen to this project if it were funded versus not funded, or to this idea, sort of, if it got the kind of support, that benefits it versus doesn't benefit it, and so on. And so, I think without sort of data that essentially like arises from like a randomized regime, we're just like in not a very good position to ever build systems that can really do this predictive job for us. And that there's going to be these sort of like, feedback loops where we then sort of predict the things to be successful. And it turns out 10 years later, they are very successful. And we're like, what a great job we did. But like that would have happened to all kinds of other things too, right? Because, funding something is, a pretty big engine of success just by itself. So I wonder sort of where do you see the limits like of all of this? Do you think that there are like principled limits? Would you sort of think that they're kind of reached even sooner or maybe much later than I sketched from this sort of pessimistic perspective? Yeah, what do you think about these things?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a great comment. Well, let's start from the first from what you first mentioned, is that kind of, are we only looking for something that will give epistemic benefit, or we, for instance, have a grant scheme that is funding the replication studies? And we can have that. And actually in the Netherlands, for instance, that exists as a special grant scheme. We could then also diversify that further. So that, again, all comes from the human decision of how to structure the system. We could also then have grant schemes, and we do have them, which are supposed to give funding for high risk, high gain research. We could potentially also have room for grant schemes which will be more randomly allocated, but in my opinion, a much smaller percentage, and very carefully and so forth. But I agree with you. So the only way, I agree, and that was the first illustration. It's an actually very hard task to assess. We are looking in the cards and are supposed to predict the epistemic success of a certain project. And what is the epistemic success? If the project actually was very promising and then failed, the negative result is also a result, is just not valued in our culture. And then how should we value it? And of course, AI can be trained if there is enough data also on what we consider to be a promising but high risk project. What I think it's more, but I mean, there, like, I can find a lot of arguments why AI is limited. I can also find a lot of arguments why humans are limited in this task. What I think it's interesting there is to compare how AI does in comparison to humans, whether it can perform, whether it can improve something or not. And I think that there is then this third issue, is that whether we like it or not, as we saw, 50% of researchers are using it, even when they are recommended not to use it. And that's just a fact. So let's try to make the best of it. And there are reasons why they are using it. Is because this shift in technology, like also other shifts in technology in the past, just demanded from humans to increase their productivity. And this demand on increasing our productivity is really hard than not to use the technology when everyone around is using it. And it's also then this comes the third question, well, why not try to profit from it? And as a last comment, just food for thought, I think this is really interesting, is how will that affect us as humans? Are we going to change our intellectual skills or focus them on different aspects now that we will increasingly use AI in science?
Thanks much.
Yeah, thank you. And then Maria.
Okay, let me try to get here. Hi, thanks for this talk. I am a professor in AI in Norway, and I work on AI ethics. And I got interested in AI being used in evaluation for projects because I write projects and I evaluate projects. And so the question I have is our attitude towards the evaluations from AI. Now, when we do evaluation from as people, and particularly with projects, and particularly with typically projects, I mean, it's supposed to be future research, right? It's not supposed to be something that is already done. And we have different levels of competence. And in a panel that evaluates the project, you will have different levels of competence. And when I feel that I'm not sufficiently competent, I will defer to whoever I think in the panel is more competent than me. Now, the issue is, how should we, I mean, human in the loop, that's nice, but what is my competence level compared to the AI? And the tricky part here is that you cannot just get used to it or get trained up to it, because the AI that evaluates today versus the AI that evaluates in the next call, two different AIs. The technology, underlying technology can change, and everything that you felt like it's a good instinct, well, not maybe everything, but quite a good deal will. So when we are talking, and we should have some feedback now from AI being used in diagnosis with in medicine. So typically what they do there is that they will replace one of the opinions in the consilium with AI and two remain with actual human doctors. The tricky part there is the doctors are actually specialists in the area that they're judging. And with projects, we are not specialists by design. So that's my question to you. Just opinions. I don't think there is an answer to this.
Sure. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you for joining. I actually, know of you.
Okay.
Yeah. So one thing why I like the virtual approach is because it's not static, but it's dynamic. And our intellect, so if we are working on our digital critical thinking and on our intellectual virtues, even when technology changes, we are actually also, because the virtue is, some would say attitude, some would say a character trait, others would say a skill, but it's definitely something which helps us process the information and which helps us learn and which helps us adapt to new challenges. And I think that's crucial with the AI, which is really will be evolving, exactly what you said. So these systems really change each year. They're different, and it's very likely that in the future, this prompt engineering won't be a thing as we might think at the moment it is. and for that, in order to have this lifelong learning and to be able to adapt and to follow the technology, we need some critical thinking, skills about the critical thinking in the digital world. That's why I like the virtual approach, intellectual virtual approach. And the question about experts. So when I talked about using the AI in the panel, so we can really have a example, right? So we have a panel evaluating a pre-proposal, then someone passes the pre-proposal, then the reviewers are sending their feedback, and then a panel is again meeting and trying to evaluate what the reviewers wrote, because the reviewers are, that's one of the grand schemes that I'm familiar with how it works, because the reviewers are experts in the field and the panel might not have such an expertise, and then people get informed by that. And the AI could be used, for instance, as an additional input, or could be used as something for pre-screening, or could give some initial advice which can be disputed by the applicants, and then the panel meets and checks all that, whether it's meaningful. So there are some days that it can be integrated, that it still interacts with humans. And also, in my opinion, I think it's very important, this rebuttal stage where the applicants can contest the AI decisions.
So asking more about training that we should have as co-evaluators with AI. It's in like, because we cannot have the same attitude as we have towards fellow human evaluators, that the failures that an AI system can do are not linear, for lack of a better term. It can just drop the ball on the most weird of things.
Yes.
So how do we get to be, I don't know, the right level of judgmental towards it, not dismiss it entirely, but also not be too different? I don't know.
Now I understand the question, and and that's the issue. That's the point exactly of the intellectual virtues, because they're the middle between two extremes. So the open-mindedness is not to trust too much, but also not to be dismissive. So intellectual courage is not to be just kind of exploring a wild hypothesis without any justification, but also not dismissing our hypothesis as soon as someone is questioning it. But this about openness to technology. So one should be intellectually open, but there is a limit to this. And how to train intellectual virtues? Well, that's a question of, I have another project on that, where we're training students. We're having an intervention with students where they're supposed to evaluate AI generated content and also write reflections about it, and to try to be kind of exactly more critical about it, but also open to use it. Well, they do use it, so they are already open to use it, and to see what can be achieved there. It is hard to be, the task of being critical towards something that is AI generated is a hard one, because it's easier for us, that's just a psychological fact, to outsource both the decision and the evaluation to someone else, and it writes a plausible thing, or we think it's good enough, but then when we check it further, it's not. And in a group discussion, students notice more errors than when they are doing it alone. So there are certain, but this is a challenge, and I think it's a challenge in front of both, not only the grant, but also I think a wider challenge in front of our education.
Perhaps the approach is to put the AI review to the human panel and say, why is it wrong?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions from the audience at the moment? I mean, I had also still one question, and maybe in part it was answered, but let's say, so from my point of view, we will see whether that's good or bad, but you included it in the last comments when you say, okay, there needs to be a panel reviewing it and I can rebut it. But so let's just look at the current evaluations, which I hope not yet fully based on AI. And then I receive a report which rejects my proposal, and I know, I mean, that is a bad decision. At least I know, I mean, I don't know the reviewers, but I know the people from the panel. So, and I can hold them responsible for it. So, and I mean, at least that's something. I know, should I say it exaggerating? Okay, I know there are some idiots sitting there, and I can tell everybody this guy is an idiot. How, I mean, to attribute this type of responsibility when I'm only dealing with AI?
Thank you so much. Indeed, it is not possible to, I mean, one can say the system needs to be updated, but someone has to be responsible for the system. And there has to, so the human has to bear the responsibility, and someone from ideally someone from the funding agency should check the system itself and try to update it and make sure how it works. And indeed, it shouldn't be used in isolation, but with all these precautions that we mentioned. But it is, when you're touching the question of who is accountable, there is the opposite thing. And this is like, okay, I used AI to write or to make a decision or to review your proposal or whatever. And now I'm signing it because I read it and so on. And I think I agree with this, or I put some changes. And then the question is, I don't know, what is our intuition? Should we say this was done using AI? Or this human can take full accountability and it's not even important to mention that AI was used?
I mean, the point is, of course, what does it mean to take accountability? But I mean, let's say I would even twist it a little bit different. I mean, of course, that person who signs it can then not escape the responsibility and say, oh, that was the AI, sorry. And I mean, and let's say from that point of view, let's say if you said, okay, it should be signed or let's say marked that AI was used, that could be, let's say, a part of information that the person can say, oh, I'm not responsible for it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that's, from my point of view, nonsensical. In some sense, if that would be put on bottom, and I would lose trust at this stage. I mean, there is this discussion, okay, maybe in a quite short time, in 1 or 2 years, we all have the feeling that the AI reports are better than the human ones. I don't know, but I mean, let's say, just make here the comparison, but with automatic translations.
Yes.
There, I really have the feeling it scales, it becomes better, and it will be very fast that we can trust these automatic translations. I have my doubts about the reviewing processes, but I mean, I could be wrong. But in any case, I mean, even with automatic translations, I would like to have, I mean, somebody, I don't say, which can be held responsible.
Yeah, I agree. That makes sense to me. And again, if it's used without a human checking the results, then we have to hold accountable the person who designed it. And I must say that I also like the other argument that you gave, because I also don't feel such a strong need why the AI use has to be flagged if someone is signed as a human there. So I share this intuition, and I like this argument that that otherwise this person can just say, no, it's not me, it's the AI. However, I noticed this also on social media and everywhere. They're like trying to flag the AI content in order to and I am always transparent when I use the AI, precisely because people kind of like to know it, because then they can kind of be more critical towards it. So they are more on alert. But indeed, the person posting or the person signing is the one who should be on alert, because the responsibility is on them. So thank you for the comment.
Okay, thank you very much. More questions, discussion points? Yeah. Cyril.
Thanks, Dr. Vlasta. I was wondering, when you do reviewing, but also editing, one of the very important, and also when you receive the reviews, one of the very important thing is just to get to have an idea of the profile of people. I mean, the epistemic profile. And this is absolutely crucial, well, first to interpret what they are saying, but also in some cases when you want to have some times of assessment from this type of persons. And so I was wondering how this could be integrated. So typically, when you're an editor, you could say, okay, I would like to have an opinion from a well-established coherentist. And then I really want something written from this perspective. So how could this be integrated in reviewing? I mean, should we say, okay, ask GPT, give me an assessment from this perspective, and then you would have to transmit it, to pass it over to the people, say, okay, we ask for our coherentist arguments, and this is what we get, and this is good stuff. So what would you say?
I mean, I see you can correct. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the question. But if you notice that I misinterpreted, please correct me. What we can do already now, I don't know if you ever tried to I'm sure you did, evaluate something with ChatGPT. Indeed, one can say it do it in the style of this and this person, in the style of this and this expertise. But we can also say it something else. We can say evaluate it harsh, or evaluate it benevolently, or give me arguments for giving a low grade, or give me arguments for giving a high grade. So of course it can be used if you want to gatekeep someone, for instance. We can very effectively use it because it can provide, it can be, or if you want to promote someone, so it can provide very good arguments depending on our instruction, what we want. So that's something that I definitely noticed.
Yeah. So the suggestion is not, but maybe what's good is not using it or not, but it's just how you're going to use it and what information you're going to pass over to the different parties that are involved. And so from my perspective, it would be totally fine to say, okay, evaluate that from this perspective, this is what we get, and then you may pass it over to the authors. And if you don't do that, then it's a real problem, I think. So, okay. So So the suggestion was, well, because of also the question concerning research integrity, is also how just to give rules of good demeanors about what you're going to do and how you're going to use it. And okay, but well, thanks.
If I understand what you're aiming at, this is again about this at the moment, how we are prompting. So are we prompting with sufficient details? Are we prompting, for instance, to really kind of look into depth? Are we using the deep research function? So what exactly are we doing with it? So that is kind of one question. But if we are talking about something that's now being, so that will give us better, more reliable insights. But if something is being done by a funding agency, then I think funding agency should provide some instructions already about this, and some basis, and probably the training data, or at least the servers and so on. So they should be more careful on how this is done, because of also the sensitivity of the data. But yeah.
And I had a second question, which is, okay, so this is a new tool, and as with all these powerful tools, you have dozens, hundreds, thousands of questions of potential things that you may do, and well, maybe at the end of the day, we don't have to make up our mind about all the different things. But what is crucial is that maybe we try to understand what are really the must do with this new tool, because we cannot. So typically, you mentioned at some point where, yes, the system is getting congested, the system is getting cluttered. And I think at a global level, it's a major problem. So here, maybe there are things that we'll have to do, otherwise we are going to just to waste our human resources. So my question is, what would be, from your perspective, the list of things that we'll have to do, and then for other things where you may have diversity of uses and it doesn't really matter?
You mean for what
what are the aspects about which we will have no choice, we'll have to do it?
Yes.
I think that the number of submissions is getting a problem, because then clearly people are more and more busy. It's more and more difficult to find reviewers. So, and in one sense, it's not necessarily people are cheating. It's just that, well, scientists are brilliant people. You give them more tools, they are just getting more efficient. So in one sense, it's normal that productivity is getting higher. But still, at the end of the day, reviewing resources in terms of cognitive resources are limited. So how would do this?
Yes, there are two different answers that I could give. One comes from this perspective of the epistemic depth. Are all these results actually bringing epistemic depth, and how to process that? And there, my colleague from Eindhoven, Chris Vassen, now has a book which I think should now become public in December. But it's about neophilia. So he's a professor of innovation, and he argues in this book against the innovation. So he's arguing in favor of slowing down science in order to stop with this cluttering. So to go from this perspective of having more time for reflection. And the idea also how this can be achieved is through the way we are funding and building the science policy. So to focus more on the replication studies and to in general like require less innovativeness and go into more of these exploratory endeavors. And it's not hard to slow science if we change the funding structure, right? Because we can go back to this other side where scientists are not very motivated and think 4 articles are enough and so on. However, I could also answer from a different from a different perspective, which might actually be closer to me. And this is that, as again, we noticed whenever a big shift happens in technology, humans get more productive. Whether the quality increases or not, that's a question. I assume over the time, the quality of science might increase. What I think is our abilities and our reliance on AI will definitely increase, which has both its pluses and minuses. And how a scientist of the future will look, I think will be different. And the knowledge that they will have will be different from the knowledge that we now need to have in order to do science. So having this encyclopedic knowledge, which we now have, is still beneficial because we can kind of make some decisions more informed and faster and so on, but it might become redundant. So that's a very interesting perspective. So which skills will be crucial? Maybe the evaluative skills. So to be able to judge quickly the epistemic benefit of a certain result instead of having this encyclopedic knowledge and being able to cite from the top of the head and so on. I am not sure, but I think we are more heading in this second direction. And there I hope that my intellectual virtue framework, I mean, I am applying it to science, it's not mine, it's a general one. I'm hoping that it will help at least a bit.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. But it's a great question.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. More comments or questions? It doesn't look so, but I mean, I think had a very good and interesting discussion.
Okay.
But
one last question.
Yeah.
Do you see a big difference between the human and social science and philosophy and other fields? Because in our fields, well, traditions are very important, perspectives are very important. So clearly, well, the way we assess things is potentially different. So do you think it makes a difference for the AI uses in the system?
I see. When someone did an experiment in biology or in psychology, and they're just supposed to write the introduction and so on, it's still problematic to only rely on AI because they might not get diverse enough literature and so forth, and not credit everyone they're supposed to credit. But my opinion is that in philosophy, the danger is because we are giving the normative suggestions.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just rely on normative suggestions from the machines, that can be very problematic. And it's easy because for us, it's a lot about writing and persuasive writing.
Yeah.
So we don't even need an experiment behind, unless we do experimental philosophy.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So maybe I have the chance to repeat the thanks to Vlasta for that great talk. The thanks to all participants also for the great discussion. And yeah, now let me have a fast check. So we will meet again in January, and I think it's then, as usual, in the last week, the Thursday, so the 29th of January, where we have our next talk. And if it opens here, no, it doesn't open. Yeah, that will Alexei Greenbaum then speaking And I hope to see you again. Again, thanks to Vlasta, to everyone of you. Have nice holidays and see you end of January. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. And thank you, Reinhard, for this wonderful sharing.
Yeah.